The first images reached Earth while most of the planet was asleep, and by the time the sun rose over North America, the war was already lost. Not lost in the dramatic sense of burning cities and screaming alarms, but lost in the cold, mathematical way that generals fear most, the kind that leaves no room for heroics or last stands. The alien armada appeared beyond the orbit of Neptune, perfectly arranged, perfectly calm, a formation so vast it bent sensor readings and swallowed background stars like a moving eclipse. Human early warning systems screamed for 6 seconds and then went quiet, not because they were destroyed, but because the data stopped making sense. In the Pentagon, analysts stared at screens that showed probabilities collapsing to zero. In the White House Situation Room, no one spoke. Somewhere deep in the Atlantic, nuclear submarines waited for orders that did not come. The aliens did not open with threats or demands. They did not broadcast a declaration. They did not posture. They simply advanced. Within hours, Earth's outer defense grid was dismantled piece by piece, not with overwhelming fire, but with precision so surgical it felt insulting. Satellites went dark in synchronized patterns. Orbital platforms lost power, then drifted, intact but useless. Human fleets scrambled, brave and determined, and died in silence as their weapons failed to lock and their engines refused commands. The aliens had studied everything. They knew the frequencies, the redundancies, the psychology. By the time the first human admiral ordered a retreat, there was nothing left to retreat with. Across the world, news feeds showed the same image on repeat. A human cruiser tumbling end over end, hull cracked, crew still alive, still trying, before vanishing in a flash that was not an explosion, but a system shutdown so complete the ship simply fell apart. Commentators called it a battle because that word made people feel better. It wasn't. It was a demonstration, and humanity failed it. If you're listening to this now, remember that moment, because it's when everything you thought you knew about war stopped being true, and it's why people still whisper about what happened next, why some stories ask to be followed quietly, the way you'd lean closer to a campfire instead of turning away. By midday, the aliens made themselves known. A single transmission over every remaining channel, translated instantly into every human language, calm and almost bored. Earth was informed that resistance had been evaluated and found inefficient. The aliens explained, politely, that humanity's military doctrine was outdated, their alliances irrelevant, their strategic thinking linear and predictable. They named themselves the Kalar Dominion, a civilization older than human agriculture, veterans of wars that had erased entire species from history. They did not demand surrender because surrender implied negotiation. They announced occupation. Human leaders were instructed to remain in place to ensure continuity of governance under Dominion oversight. The message ended with a suggestion, not a threat, that further resistance would result in corrective action. Across the United States, emergency broadcasts interrupted programming. People watched from living rooms, diners, night shifts, phones clutched in shaking hands. The tone was controlled, the words measured, but the fear underneath was unmistakable. This was not an enemy you could rally against. This was gravity. In the following hours, alien dropships appeared in the upper atmosphere, not descending, just waiting, a reminder. Human governments convened emergency sessions. Military commanders argued for counterattacks that everyone knew would fail. Civilian leaders spoke of evacuation plans that could not possibly work. And then something strange happened. Orders stopped. Not because communications were cut, but because no new commands were issued, no emergency powers invoked. The silence from Earth's leadership was so complete that alien observers flagged it as a data anomaly. The Kalar expected panic, then rage, then desperate defiance. They had seen it countless times. Instead, humanity paused. In a world trained to react instantly, the lack of reaction felt wrong, like a skipped heartbeat. Somewhere in the Midwest, a truck driver listening to the radio muttered that it felt like the calm before a tornado. He wasn't wrong. The first occupation forces landed without resistance. Kalar troops moved through cities in disciplined lines, their armor smooth and faceless, their movements efficient. They did not fire on civilians. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough. Human police stood aside. National Guard units received stand-down orders that came with no explanation. In New York, an alien commander addressed a joint session of emergency leadership, explaining new regulations, curfews, and data access requirements with the tone of a bureaucrat reviewing zoning laws. The aliens were not cruel. That was the problem. They were thorough. They took control of power grids, communications hubs, financial systems, all without breaking a single human law, using legal frameworks they had studied in advance. The Kalar believed in order, and order required compliance, not terror. And humanity complied. On screens across the country, commentators struggled to explain why no one was fighting back. Some called it cowardice, others called it pragmatism. A few noticed something else, something unsettling in the body language of officials who spoke to the public. They did not look defeated, they looked focused, as if they were waiting for a signal only they could hear. A late-night host joked that maybe humans were finally tired of war. The joke didn't land, because even then, in that uneasy quiet, people felt it. Wars do not end like this. They do not simply stop. The Kalar High Command convened in orbit to review the operation. Their analysts confirmed what the data already showed. Human resistance had collapsed far faster than projected. Casualties were minimal. Infrastructure was intact. The planet would be productive within months. Dominion philosophers recorded the event as a case study in efficient conquest. A junior strategist raised a concern, noting irregular patterns in human data flows, sudden drops in network traffic that did not align with infrastructure damage.
The concern was dismissed. Humans were emotional creatures, prone to denial and shock. Reduced activity was expected. The Dominion turned its attention to expansion plans, already allocating Earth's resources to ongoing campaigns elsewhere. And that's when the first human signal went out. It did not originate from a military base or government building. It came from everywhere at once, embedded in mundane traffic, financial pings, weather updates, social media posts, invisible unless you knew exactly how to look. The signal carried no message, no threat, no coordinates. It was a command, not sent outward, but inward. Across the planet, systems quietly changed state. Servers disconnected themselves from networks. Automated factories powered down mid-cycle. Military hardware entered maintenance modes that required human hands to restart. The Kalar noticed the slowdown within hours. Productivity projections dipped. Energy consumption patterns shifted. Still, no alarms. Then, human leaders issued a second global address. It was short. It was calm. It did not mention the Kalar by name. It announced the suspension of all offensive and defensive military operations worldwide. Effective immediately, humanity was no longer at war. Not surrender, not ceasefire, something else. The wording was precise. Across the United States, people stared at screens in disbelief. Veterans felt a hollow ache they couldn't explain. Active duty soldiers stood down, weapons locked away by orders that felt final. The Kalar interpreted the announcement as formal capitulation. They logged it as compliance. They were wrong. Within days, the consequences began to ripple outward. Human logistics chains, once the backbone of global commerce, slowed to a crawl. Ports operated at minimal capacity. Air traffic dropped to a fraction of normal levels. Financial markets stabilized briefly, then froze, not crashing, just stopping, transactions pending without resolution. The Kellar demanded explanations. Human officials responded politely, explaining that wartime protocols had been deactivated and peacetime systems were recalibrating. It was all very reasonable. Too reasonable. Alien occupation forces found themselves with plenty of authority but diminishing capability. Their equipment required human infrastructure to function, and that infrastructure was quietly opting out. Meanwhile, beyond Earth, something even more troubling occurred. Kellar fleets in other sectors began reporting anomalies. Supply shipments were delayed by human contractors invoking force majeure clauses. Software updates failed to authenticate. Maintenance schedules slipped. None of it looked like sabotage. It looked like bureaucracy, the most dangerous weapon humanity ever built. In Dominion command chambers, irritation replaced confidence. Humans were being difficult, inefficient, uncooperative. The idea that this could be intentional was considered and rejected. Humans were defeated. Defeated species did not have strategies, they had excuses. And yet, in the background, human media began to change. The tone shifted from fear to reflection. Stories about past wars, costs, mistakes, quiet reminders of how much humanity had lost fighting enemies that no longer existed. Listeners were drawn in, leaning closer, sharing clips the way you might share a warning with a friend, because some stories feel important to pass along. The Kellar monitored the content and saw nothing threatening. They did not understand why a species that had just lost everything sounded relieved. The first true alarm came when a Kellar task force attempted to redeploy from Earth orbit and failed. Engines spooled, then shut down, safety protocols triggered by parameters no one could override. Human technicians were summoned. They arrived, polite, professional, and explained that the engines were operating within design limits, but external dependencies were no longer supported. The technicians offered to help, in time, once new frameworks were agreed upon. The Kellar commander threatened punishment. The humans nodded and documented the request. Nothing changed. Hours turned into days. The task force remained stranded, not under attack, not sabotaged, simply paused. Across the Dominion, similar reports accumulated. Fleets grounded, weapons locked, systems awaiting permissions that would never arrive. And in a quiet room deep beneath Washington, a group of people watched the data roll in and said nothing. They had not fired a shot. They had not issued a threat. They had done something far more dangerous. They had turned off the war. And as the Kellar finally began to understand that victory required an enemy willing to fight, a question spread through alien command like a slow, creeping dread. If humans were no longer fighting, what exactly were they doing instead?
The Kellar Dominion believed control was a matter of pressure applied in the right places, and at first nothing about Earth contradicted that belief, because human cities remained lit, governments remained functional, and no riots filled the streets. Yet beneath that calm surface, the machinery of occupation began to grind against something it could not crush. Because humans were not resisting, they were disengaging. And the difference mattered more than any weapon, as Dominion administrators quickly discovered when their first directives stalled inside systems that acknowledged commands but never executed them. Power grids shifted to autonomous safety cycles. Financial networks queued transactions indefinitely under perfectly legal compliance reviews. Logistics software rerouted shipments into holding patterns that satisfied every regulation while delivering nothing. And when Kellar officers demanded explanations, human specialists arrived promptly, spoke politely, and produced documentation so dense and internally consistent that even Dominion legal minds struggled to challenge it. And this pattern repeated everywhere. airports without flights yet fully staffed, factories operating at minimum output to maintain safety certifications, data centers humming quietly while refusing new integrations, all of it lawful, all of it cooperative, all of it useless to an occupier who required speed and obedience. And as days passed, Dominion planners noticed something even more unsettling. There was no central node to seize, no headquarters to storm, because humanity had already decentralized everything that mattered, not as a wartime measure, but as a cultural habit born from centuries of internal mistrust, corporate competition, and political fragmentation. And now those flaws became armor, because every attempt to impose top-down control fractured into 1,000 local negotiations that went nowhere. And while Dominion soldiers patrolled streets and stood guard over silent facilities, human media filled the space with something far more dangerous than propaganda: memory. Calm voices recounting past wars, past occupations, past moments when victory turned hollow. Stories framed not as calls to action, but as shared understanding, spreading quietly through households, workplaces, and personal feeds. The kind of content people listen to closely and pass along because it feels important to hear. And Dominion analysts flagged the trend too late, dismissing it as harmless reflection, not realizing that humanity was synchronizing emotionally while appearing disengaged. And as Earth's output declined without collapsing, Dominion's supply lines began to strain, because Earth had not been a prize so much as a keystone, its industries woven invisibly into interstellar systems the Dominion relied upon. And with those systems now politely unavailable, distant fleets waited for replacement parts that remained in customs limbo. Shipyards delayed refits due to missing certifications, and entire campaigns slowed as if the galaxy itself had developed friction. And when the High Command demanded emergency overrides, they discovered that human-built systems treated such actions as potential hazards, automatically triggering review cycles that required human consensus to resolve. Consensus that never came, because humanity had collectively agreed on one thing without ever announcing it: they would not accelerate the war again. And frustration turned to anger as Dominion governors issued ultimatums that echoed unanswered, because humans did respond, just never in the way expected. Every threat met with documentation, every deadline met with extension requests justified by safety, ethics, or environmental impact, until even the most aggressive Kellar commanders felt trapped inside a maze of human process designed to outlast aggression. And it was then that the Dominion attempted a symbolic act of dominance, ordering a formal surrender ceremony to be broadcast across Earth, believing that humiliation would break the spell. But the response they received shook them more deeply than open defiance ever could, because human representatives calmly explained that surrender was unnecessary, that surrender implies the continuation of hostilities, and humanity had already ended its participation in the conflict. A statement so alien to Dominion doctrine that it triggered emergency philosophical review. And as confusion spread through command halls, reports arrived from beyond Earth, human trade hubs across neutral space suspending operations under identical frameworks, allied species citing human precedent to disengage from Dominion conflicts entirely, declaring neutrality through procedural compliance rather than rebellion. And suddenly the Dominion faced a cascading disengagement it could not punish without shattering the very order it depended on, because conquest required subjects who believed in the structure of war, and humanity had quietly removed that belief from the equation. And in the high command chamber, beneath drifting star maps and fading projections, a senior strategist finally articulated the fear taking shape across the Dominion, his voice low as he reviewed data showing declining authority without a single shot fired. "Humans are not fighting us," he said. "They are making us irrelevant." And as silence followed, a deeper realization settled in, because empires are built to respond to resistance, not absence. And somewhere beneath Earth's surface, systems designed not to attack but to withdraw continued their flawless execution, leaving the Dominion to confront a truth it had never prepared for, that war requires consent, and humanity had withdrawn it. And if that was only the first thing humans had turned off, then the Dominion had no idea what would disappear next. The Dominion did not collapse all at once because empires rarely do. Instead, it began to bend in places no strategist had thought to reinforce, as killer fleets idled in distant systems, awaiting supplies that never arrived, and governors on occupied worlds issued orders that were acknowledged, logged, and then quietly buried under layers of human-defined process. And what terrified the Dominion most was not sabotage, but normalcy, because everything still looked intact on the surface. Cities functioned, populations ate, power flowed just enough to prevent crisis. Yet nothing accelerated, nothing surged, nothing responded to pressure. And the more the Dominion pushed, the more resistance dissolved into calm procedure, until the High Command authorized direct intervention, a galaxy-wide escalation that would bypass cooperation entirely. Yet even this plan unraveled the moment it touched human systems, because Dominion engineers discovered that override authority itself depended on trust architectures humans had designed, systems that assumed mutual participation and ethical continuity. And when those assumptions failed, the machines did not break, they disengaged, triggering safety states that could not be forced without destroying the infrastructure the Dominion needed intact. And destruction was unacceptable because Earth was too valuable, too interconnected, too essential. And as this realization spread, reports from across the galaxy began arriving in alarming volume. Allied client states experiencing similar slowdowns, trade corridors stalling, not through rebellion but compliance, human-designed arbitration systems freezing disputes indefinitely, emergency response networks entering observation-only modes, and suddenly Dominion commanders found themselves trapped in a civilization-wide pause they could neither reverse nor punish, because every attempt to impose force risked cascading failure, and fear crept upward through the ranks, subtle at first, expressed as irritation, then as exhaustion, then finally as something far more dangerous, doubt, because soldiers began asking why they were standing guard over silent factories and empty command centers, why no one was fighting them, why victory felt like stagnation, and morale cracked not under fire but under waiting, and the killer species had never learned how to wait without purpose. And while this unfolded, human media completed its quiet transformation, shifting from historical reflection to something more intimate. Personal accounts of veterans, engineers, doctors, people who spoke not of glory but of cost, of what endless conflict hollowed out over generations. Stories framed not as condemnation but as warning, shared quietly, spread gently, the kind of content that invites listeners to stay a little longer, to pass it along because it feels like something others should hear too. And Dominion analysts, trained to detect agitation and mobilization, failed to understand that this was coordination without commands, unity without hierarchy, a species aligning itself emotionally while appearing passive. And then the first Dominion sector governor resigned, citing inability to execute duties due to systemic non-cooperation, a shocking act that rippled outward as other officials requested reassignment or medical leave, their reports filled with phrases like operational paralysis and undefined resistance. And in response, the High Command issued harsher directives, threats of collective punishment, seizure of assets, population controls. Yet each threat collided with human systems that required active participation to enforce, participation that was no longer forthcoming. And when Dominion troops attempted to impose direct rule, they found themselves isolated, dependent on supply chains that no longer functioned, operating equipment that slowly degraded without human maintenance, and forced to rely on local populations who complied politely while providing nothing of urgency. And it was during this period that a classified intelligence synthesis reached the Dominion Council, compiled from overlooked human data, historical parallels, psychological modeling, and one chilling conclusion, that humanity had not disengaged impulsively. This was not shock or despair, it was doctrine, an ancient survival pattern triggered when conventional victory was impossible. A strategy humans had used against forces too large to fight directly, to outlast, to exhaust, to remove the incentive for conflict entirely. And the report warned that this was only phase one, that once disengagement stabilized, humanity historically transitioned into phase two, the reshaping of the environment around the aggressor, not through attack, but through absence, until the aggressor's own systems failed under their weight. And as the Council absorbed this, reports arrived confirming the pattern, Dominion shipyards shutting down due to missing human certifications, research facilities halting experiments over unresolved ethical flags embedded in shared code bases, financial reserves draining as interstellar commerce slowed to a crawl. And suddenly, the Dominion faced a terrifying equation. They could escalate militarily and destroy what they sought to control, or they could wait and watch their empire slowly suffocate. And in the silence that followed, one ancient admiral, older than most star systems under Dominion rule, spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of conquest. "We are fighting a species that has decided war is optional," he said. "And if war is optional, then power is fragile." And as his words settled over the chamber, an urgent alert interrupted the session, a Dominion core world reporting a complete halt in human-linked systems, not failure, not sabotage, just disengagement. A planetary-scale pause that froze logistics, governance, and defense simultaneously. And as the Council stared at the data in disbelief, one truth finally crystallized. Humanity had not turned off the war to survive. They had turned it off to demonstrate something far worse, that they could turn off an empire without firing a single shot. And as the Dominion scrambled to respond, Earth remained silent, waiting. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the next phase was already beginning.
The Kalar Dominion realized, too late, that patience had become humanity's weapon. Because while alien strategists scrambled to interpret the scale of disengagement, humans were already executing the second layer of their plan, subtle, pervasive, and invisible to anyone who judged warfare by explosions or troop movements. Power grids that had merely paused began to reroute energy in patterns that isolated Dominion outposts, rerouting fuel to storage depots that required human access to unlock, while communications networks remained active but clogged with streams of mundane data, not encryption or threats, just reports, memos, logistics updates, and every single transaction carefully annotated, perfectly legal, and deliberately opaque. And the effect was immediate. A cascade of operational paralysis that spread across Dominion-controlled sectors. Fleets that expected orders to jump into action remained locked in orbit. Fuel calculations suddenly exceeded limits, navigation protocols triggered error loops, and all the while humans continued their silence on the surface, walking streets, attending jobs, living routines that masked the true scope of their control.
and the Dominion had no choice but to send analysts in, who discovered that human infrastructure was built around contingency, redundancy, and ethical overrides, frameworks that assumed cooperation, not compliance, and when compliance was removed, systems defaulted to safe modes humans could manipulate, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And as Dominion engineers struggled to bypass these safeguards, they were confronted with another layer: social compliance, the subtle cohesion of millions of humans who followed rules for their own reasons, obeying laws, regulations, and internalized procedures in a way that made alien threats irrelevant. Fleets stranded, outposts idle, and governors unable to act without relying on humans who simply would not participate, politely refusing, documenting every interaction, and the Kalar Council convened a crisis session, projecting the spiral of paralysis across the next dozen sectors, only to discover the effect multiplied exponentially because wherever humans had been involved, Dominion operations stalled, and any attempt to escalate militarily risked destroying essential infrastructure and alien forces themselves, leaving them vulnerable not to attack, but to inaction. And the realization began to spread, creeping across the faces of commanders who had never known fear, that Earth's population had turned disengagement into a weapon, and that no fleet could overcome a species that refused to fight on the terms of their enemy. Yet every action they tried to take seemed predicted, anticipated, and countered not by brute force, but by human systems and protocols operating exactly as designed. And as analysts traced the flow of commerce, energy, and information, they realized that humans had spent decades, centuries even, building the ability to make war optional at a planetary scale. That the moment they disengaged, the very machinery of civilization became a cage for any external aggressor. And the Council sat in silence, absorbing reports that fleets had become liabilities, outposts unreachable, communications redundant but irrelevant, and even Dominion allies reconsidering allegiance because humans had proven an absence could be as powerful as an army. And while the Kalar debated, human signals expanded, not to strike, not to demand, but to observe, to record, to spread the quiet doctrine of patience and disengagement across every network they controlled, a message that said nothing and yet implied everything. And when the first Dominion admiral publicly confessed that he had no means to compel Earth, that every escalation they tried had collapsed under invisible human authority, a ripple of panic spread through command halls. Whispers of fear that humanity was not defeated, had never been engaged, and the true danger was that this withdrawal was only the first act of a plan that no alien could anticipate. And as the Council scanned every sector for anomalies, one small warning beacon blinked from deep space, indicating a human-linked node outside the system, autonomous, mobile, and apparently waiting. And the Admiral's voice dropped to a whisper as he repeated what no one wanted to admit. They are not silent because they cannot fight. They are silent because they are already winning.
The Kalar Dominion reached a point where confusion became fear, because their calculations, once precise and reliable, now produced results that made no sense. Supply fleets en route to occupied worlds were delayed indefinitely under bureaucratic hold. Navigation systems refused commands unless human-authorized overrides were applied, and even the smallest military maneuver required certifications that had been quietly revoked, paused, or rerouted without human oversight ever seeming necessary. And as alien commanders demanded explanations, they were met with polite, meticulously documented responses, citations of policy, law, safety regulations, and ethical standards that effectively neutralized authority without confrontation. And while these invisible constraints immobilized entire sectors, human civilians continued daily life with no hint of strain, going to work, caring for families, attending school,
all while the hidden infrastructure of the planet quietly bent every external force to human-defined rules, demonstrating a control so absolute it made traditional warfare irrelevant. And the Dominion's psychological shock deepened when reports came in from allied planets that had been integrated into Earth's trade and communication networks, showing the same pattern: systems stalling, fleets idling, production slowing to minimum safety thresholds, each action legal, rational, and perfectly coordinated across space and time. And no human had fired a shot, no fleet had moved, no soldier had drawn a weapon. Yet across the galaxy, Dominion officials whispered of panic, muttered of helplessness, because they realized that without compliance, there was no war, only a slow, inevitable collapse of command. And when the High Command attempted to escalate, to override, to forcibly seize control, the result was the same everywhere. Machines and bureaucracies designed for cooperation refused to operate under coercion. Engineers could not be compelled to act without authorization, and supply lines, once fluid, were now a labyrinth of harmless but insurmountable procedural hurdles, leaving Dominion fleets stranded and commanders powerless. And then the first signs of human offensive logic appeared, not as attacks, but as manipulation of perception, as humans allowed Dominion sensors to detect small, meaningless signals in precise patterns, feeding the illusion of action while the reality of inertia grew, creating tension in alien crews who waited for something to happen, and nothing did. And while the Dominion burned with frustration, human media quietly broadcast reflections on empire, conquest, and the hollow victories of the past, framing them as lessons rather than propaganda. Content shared widely, engaged with, copied, analyzed, and the effect was contagious. Alien populations under Dominion rule began to hesitate, to question, to slow cooperation in ways that multiplied Earth's influence without any direct intervention. And when Dominion scientists attempted to model human behavior, they encountered data loops designed to be logically consistent yet strategically unpredictable, networks that gave every appearance of function while subtly redirecting resources, delaying projects, and enforcing priorities that aligned with human interests, a form of resistance that required no fleet, no soldier, only understanding and patience. And as reports of isolated systems failing to operate correctly multiplied, the High Command convened an emergency session, staring at star maps that were still filled with Dominion fleets, but seeing no way to make them effective. And a voice, quiet and trembling, finally cut through the chamber. They are not fighting, they are not resisting, they are simply not participating, and in that absence lies their victory. And as the council sat in stunned silence, another alert appeared. A mobile human node had been detected outside the solar system, moving independently, maintaining zero communications, fully autonomous, with patterns that suggested observation, control, and anticipation. And the council realized, with a cold understanding, that the humans had not only turned off the war, they had already begun the next phase, and no Dominion officer, no fleet, no strategy could stop what was already in motion.
The Kalar Dominion, for the first time in its millennia of conquest, began to panic, not because humans had attacked or destroyed anything, but because they had weaponized absence. And the scope of that weapon was now becoming clear across occupied worlds as power grids remained online but entirely uncooperative. Communication nodes sent signals that were syntactically correct yet operationally useless. Logistics networks redirected fleets into endless loops of legal compliance, and alien engineers found themselves helpless before protocols designed by the very species they had thought broken, while Dominion soldiers, trained for obedience and aggression, patrolled silent cities that were fully functional but completely neutral to their presence.
And across the galaxy, every attempt at escalation, military, political, economic, was absorbed and nullified by a civilization that refused to play by conventional rules. And when fleet commanders attempted to isolate human-controlled sectors, they found that Earth's influence had quietly spread into their own systems, subtle programming, autonomous nodes, and redundant protocols that required human consent to operate. And with each passing day, Dominion supply lines stalled, fleets idled, and allied client species cited Earth's precedents to withdraw cooperation, citing policy, ethics, and safety, never rebellion, but leaving the Dominion increasingly isolated and desperate. And within occupied cities, human civilians walked streets calmly, going about ordinary lives, while engineers, bureaucrats, and administrators executed invisible operations with no sign of urgency. And the Kalar analysts finally acknowledged the terrifying pattern that humans were not passive, not waiting, not surrendering. They were orchestrating a shutdown of Dominion control from within, a collapse engineered without weapons, without violence, only patience, precision, and the quiet application of rules the Dominion itself had insisted remain. And the High Council, now meeting in secret on the edge of occupied space, faced the impossible. A war could not be fought when one side no longer agreed to participate. Fleets could not move without cooperation, systems could not function without consent, and every escalation only amplified human influence, as every failed override, every frozen outpost, every delayed supply convoy added to the momentum of this silent campaign. And as they debated desperate measures, reports came from the outskirts of the solar system, a single autonomous human node moving through deep space, untraceable except by subtle shifts in gravitational and electromagnetic readings, patterns that suggested observation, prediction, control. And the Council realized collectively that this was no reconnaissance, no scouting, no strike force, but a sentinel, a harbinger of the next phase of human strategy. And the admiral in charge of coordinating the Dominion response whispered, almost to himself, but loud enough for the chamber to hear, "We are not fighting them. We are being disarmed by non-existence. And if this is only one node, then there are more, and the humans have already turned the entire galaxy into a chessboard we cannot touch." And somewhere far below Earth's surface, systems quietly aligned, nodes activated, redundancies optimized, and humanity waited, calm, precise, unstoppable. And the Dominion could do nothing but watch as a war they thought was theirs to control slipped entirely out of their hands. By this point, the Dominion had abandoned every conventional approach, because every fleet, every outpost, every command had become a liability in a war humans refused to fight. And yet the galaxy itself began to bend to Earth's design, subtly, invisibly, as human-linked nodes activated in sectors far beyond the solar system, rerouting energy, redirecting traffic, suspending production, and enforcing delays so precise and consistent that alien systems, even the most advanced, began to behave as if controlled by some unseen hand. And Dominion commanders, desperate, tried to coordinate, to consolidate, to force obedience through brute force, only to find that every escalation was anticipated, accounted for, and rendered ineffective by layers of process, law, ethics, and automated human oversight that functioned without personnel and yet depended entirely on human design. And across occupied planets, alien administrators discovered that civilians complied not out of fear, but because systems, regulations, and protocols still applied, and that compliance, perfectly rational, perfectly legal, ensured the Dominion could not compel action without destroying the very fabric of what they thought they controlled. And as weeks turned into months, morale collapsed. Soldiers abandoned posts quietly, leaving vehicles and installations idle, while commanders monitored reports showing fleets stranded, factories non-functional, communications intact but useless, and every attempt to regain authority only accelerated the decline. And through it all, human society continued, calmly, efficiently, the quiet discipline of a species that understood that power could be exercised without confrontation, that war could be ended without a fight, and every story broadcast, every shared memory, every documentary on past empires subtly reinforced the lesson, teaching those who listened that humans were not defeated because humans did not fight on conventional terms. And as Dominion analysts attempted to model these events, they discovered the impossible. No calculation could predict the next human move, because humans did not move as an army, they moved as a civilization, coordinated, patient, omnipresent, and utterly inscrutable. And just when the High Council thought they had reached the limit of this strategy, reports came in of human nodes entering interstellar trade lanes, not attacking, not coercing, not negotiating, but quietly disabling infrastructure, diverting shipments, grounding fleets under legal and procedural authority, leaving Dominion forces stranded. And the panic that had begun as fear now turned to despair, whispers echoing through command halls, old generals muttering to one another, "This is not a battle, this is something else entirely." And the first human contact with outer systems occurred not with weapons but with information, footage of collapsed empires, failed conquests, histories of civilizations that underestimated their opponents, memories shared instantly across every interface, causing confusion, hesitation, and outright refusal among alien forces to act. And the Council finally understood the truth, that humans had not only turned off the war, they had redefined it, stripping the Dominion of the ability to operate in any meaningful way. And as reports of yet another sector coming to a full standstill arrived, one voice, trembling with realization, summed it up in a whisper that carried across the chamber. "They are not fighting to win. They are fighting to remove us from the equation entirely." And somewhere deep within the planet, systems aligned, nodes synchronized, a final measure prepared, ready to unfold in the next cycle, a silent strike so complete that even victory itself would mean nothing to the humans who had planned it. And the Dominion, for the first time in their history, understood a horrifying possibility, that a species that could end war without lifting a weapon could end an empire without firing a shot.
The final phase began not with fire, not with fleets, not with an explosion that could be measured from light years away, but with silence, a silence so profound that it was almost physical, pressing against the Dominion's command halls, drifting into orbiting stations, and settling into every sector where humans had once engaged. Because every system they touched, power grids, communication relays, supply lines, fleets, automated factories, entered a state of careful dormancy, perfectly functional yet entirely inert to alien intervention. And as the Dominion scrambled to react, sending instructions, issuing threats, mobilizing every available asset, they found themselves trapped in an unprecedented paradox. Their authority existed, their technology existed, yet nothing moved unless humans willed it, and humans had willed nothing. And everywhere the Dominion looked, their empire was unraveling under the quiet insistence of absence. Fleets stranded, outposts silent, governments compliant but powerless, allied species disengaging after witnessing the precision of human control. And the galaxy itself seemed to pause, caught between what had been and what was now being orchestrated invisibly from a single planet, while humans, calm, methodical, observed from beneath their cities, from stations hidden among the stars, from nodes moving silently in the void, and no one could see them, yet their influence stretched farther than any weapon, any fleet, any empire could ever hope to reach.
And as weeks passed, Dominion leaders attempted one last desperate gambit, assembling a combined strike force across 5 sectors, hoping to overwhelm human systems by brute coordination, only to find that every aspect of the operation was already neutralized by the very frameworks they relied upon. Fuel convoys rerouted, navigation arrays paused for safety compliance, communications flooded with lawful requests that required human authorization, all harmless, all perfectly polite, all immovable. And the High Council finally met in panic, realizing the staggering truth that humans had never fought to win battles, never needed to, that their doctrine was not conquest or destruction, but control, patience, and denial of participation, and that they had executed it flawlessly across the galaxy, demonstrating that an empire could be neutralized without violence, without combat, and without surrender. And when the first Dominion senator asked what they should do now, the only answer came from the whisper of a senior admiral, staring at his terminal filled with idle fleets and frozen commands. The war is over, and we lost without a fight. And somewhere on Earth, in a quiet chamber under layers of reinforced concrete, humans prepared for nothing, stood for nothing, did nothing, because they had already done everything. And the last message to reach the Dominion, simple, unemotional, and terrifying in its clarity, transmitted through every remaining channel, read, "You asked for war. It is over." And when silence finally returned to the galaxy, it carried a lesson every civilization would remember, that humanity does not fight to win battles. Humanity fights to end the idea of war itself. And the Kalar Dominion, still extant but fractured beyond repair, would never forget it.